The Flaxborough Literary Society met, as it always did, on the first Thursday of every month, in the chilly upstairs room of the Mechanics' Institute, a place whose acoustics had once been compared favourably to a biscuit tin with ambition. The members were largely devoted to reading aloud poems nobody had requested, which they nevertheless delivered with great earnestness and occasional mispronounced French. Inspector Purbright had not intended to attend. His evening had promised a quiet hour with a pot of tea and the comforting, if dry, report on council expenditure. But a last-minute polite summons from Mrs. Babbicome, who threatened tears unless a proper authoritative presence were in the audience, had persuaded him to make the sacrifice. He sat near the back, coat neatly folded, face arranged into an expression of gentle appreciation. Across the room, Mrs. Babbicome recited a long free-verse piece about her late husband's fondness for celery. It lasted 9 minutes. At the conclusion, the audience applauded with relief disguised as admiration. Outside, the town lay hushed beneath a brittle spring night. The gas lamps along Market Row gave off their usual amber glow, softened by a light mist that drifted in from the river. It was all, as Purbright thought with some satisfaction, perfectly ordinary, which made the interruption all the more peculiar. It began with a faint tremor in the air, a sound so slight that 1 or 2 listeners assumed it was the radiator attempting rebellion. But the noise grew, not louder exactly, but clearer, like something adjusting itself into focus. A woman's voice, drawn out, lilting, and underscored with something that could have been fear or longing. "Is anyone there?" The poets froze. Mrs. Babbicome emitted a small squeak, clasping her folder of elegies to her chest. Mr. Tring, who fancied himself an expert in the supernatural, muttered "a visitation" with such reverence that one suspected he had been practicing the line. The voice floated again through the night, carried across the square and slipping through the slightly open window of the Mechanics' Institute. "Please, someone." A few people stood, as though proximity to the sound might grant understanding. Purbright rose more slowly. The timbre of the voice struck him as odd, not frantic, but curiously measured, the way one might speak when attempting to be overheard. He moved to the window. The square below lay empty except for a newspaper caught against a lamppost, and the distant figure of the milk delivery boy, Tommy Keever, who seemed rooted in place. "Inspector," the boy called up, sounding both thrilled and terrified. "It came from the tower. I swear it did." Purbright glanced toward the disused clock tower at the far end of the square. A black silhouette against the faint moonlight, the structure had gone untouched for years. The wiring had been removed long ago. Even the pigeons had abandoned it out of boredom. "Did you hear it more than once, Tommy?" Purbright asked, voice mild. "Aye, sir. Clear as me own mum." Behind him, the members of the Literary Society were whispering urgently, filling the room with crackling staccato speculation. That was no living voice. Perhaps someone's trapped. It sounded like poor Mrs. Hargraves. She does like to dramatize. I always said the tower was unsafe. Purbright closed the window, not because he wished to muffle the gossip, but because he suspected the voice, whatever its source, was already finished for the evening. He descended the stairs, waited patiently while Mrs. Babbicome insisted on accompanying him for moral support, and stepped into the cool night air. Tommy Keever trotted over, eyes wide. "Sir, it were a woman, sad-like, asking for help." "Did she say anything else?" Purbright asked. Tommy hesitated. Well, sounded like she was singing a bit, or echoing. Mrs. Babbicome shivered. Echoing. Inspector, that's very grave. Echoes imply hollowness, something empty, or open. Purbright inclined his head. Quite so, madam. He approached the base of the tower. The heavy wooden door was bolted as usual. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints in the soft patch of soil nearby. No marks on the door. No signs of anyone forcing entry. Constable Malley arrived, slightly out of breath and wearing an expression that suggested he expected to find a corpse, or worse, paperwork. Evening, sir. Got 2 calls at the station. Folks claiming they heard a woman's cry. You reckon it's real? Purbright examined the silent tower before answering. Real enough to be heard, he said. As for the origin, well, that may take some consideration. Malley leaned closer. Could be some joker with a megaphone, sir. Possibly. Though if so, they've shown considerable foresight in choosing a location without electricity or shelter. Mrs. Babbicome gasped, as though electricity itself might take offence. Purbright did not investigate further that night. He simply stood a moment longer, listening to the familiar quiet of Flaxborough settling back into place. The voice had been brief, but it had stirred something delicate. The town's instinctive readiness to embroider any oddity into a sweeping tale. As he walked Mrs. Babbicome home, she insisted she was too shaken to proceed unescorted. Purbright found himself replaying the sound. There had been a deliberateness in it, a careful pacing, not a cry of terror, something closer to a message, and messages, he knew, were rarely sent without a purpose. By the time he reached his own front gate, the town had fallen still again, but somewhere in the back of his mind, faint, no more than a whisper, the midnight voice lingered, almost as though it were waiting. By morning, the midnight voice had grown taller, thinner, louder, stranger, and more tragic, depending entirely on who was recounting it and to whom. Flaxborough possessed a natural genius for the embroidered rumour. Give it even the faintest thread, and it would produce a tapestry. The news began its steady bloom just after 7, when Mrs. Babbicome, having slept poorly and risen early in a state of artistic affliction, recounted her version of the incident to the milkman. Her version included a tremulous hand to the breast and the conviction that the voice had been otherworldly, Inspector Purbright confirmed, and possibly connected to atmospheric conditions. The milkman, whose tolerance for the supernatural was proportionate to the number of steps between him and breakfast, passed on only the first of these points to his next customer. By 9 o'clock, the tale had already multiplied into 3 competing interpretations across Market Row. At the bakery queue, Mrs. Fenshaw declared it must have been a woman trapped inside the clock tower. Locked in by persons unknown, she added darkly, as though such persons lurked regularly behind municipal architecture. At the greengrocer's, the story had grown more dramatic. The voice was said to have risen in a crescendo of despair, a lamentation heard not once but 3 times, and accompanied, curiously, by the tolling of a bell no one remembered ringing. Over at the ironmonger's counter, Councillor Coxon contributed his own authoritative view. I've said it before, he informed a cluster of customers who had not asked, and I shall say it again. The youth of today are entirely too experimental with their electronics. Amplifiers, oscillators, wave projectors. The lot. Mark my words, some young madam with a gadget has been trying to frighten us. He nodded to himself with such conviction that several listeners accepted this simply to avoid the work of imagining alternatives. Meanwhile, the vicar, pausing outside the post office, offered a gentler explanation. Sound carries oddly around the square, he said, hands folded behind his back. A whisper can become a supplication. We mustn't assume distress where there may only be distance. But even his calm interpretation was retold minutes later as evidence that the church was aware of previous incidents of voices, which naturally no one had heard until today. By 10, Purbright had received no fewer than 4 telephone calls at the station, each call polite, each caller anxious not to make a fuss, and each recounting a slight variation of the event. One gentleman insisted the voice had sounded precisely like his wife before her elocution lessons. Another claimed he had heard laughter, not pleading. A third produced the confident assertion that the voice had been that of a middle-aged soprano, perhaps trained, though he admitted he had been indoors with the wireless playing at the time. Constable Malley, seated opposite his superior with a notebook full of contradictions, finally ventured, "Should we treat it as a disturbance, sir? Or, well, something more?" Purbright sipped his tea with deliberate calm. "At present, Malley, it is something less. Less, sir. Less certain, less clear, less dramatic than reported. Rumour has a way of improving itself." Malley considered this, uncertain whether improvement was quite the word. Purbright set aside the teacup. "Nevertheless, we must follow the matter. Voices do not materialize without agency, natural or otherwise." He said no more, but his expression, mild, reflective, suggested he had already begun sorting the useful from the fanciful. Just before midday, he stepped out onto Market Row to observe the town in its industrious state of agitation. Shop fronts bustled, groups clustered like flocks rearranging themselves against an unexpected breeze. Conversations paused as he passed, then resumed with renewed vigour the moment his back was turned. Outside the Blue Cobbler public house, the landlord, Mr. Rudge, intercepted him. "Morning, Inspector. Terrible goings-on last night's business. Heard from Mrs. Tether you were there to witness it yourself." "I heard something," Purbright said. "The details vary rather widely." "Oh, they do, Rudge agreed with relish. "By my count we've had a ghost, a jilted lover, a visiting opera singer, and a lost tourist from Sheffield, all doing the wailing." He leaned in. "Mark my words, Inspector. If this keeps up, you'll be arresting half the town for listening too hard." Purbright thanked him and continued on. He found Tommy Keever outside the general store, delivering milk crates with the air of someone carrying both dairy products and dangerous secrets. The boy's account had become something of a touchstone for the more sensational storytellers. "Tommy," Purbright greeted, "how is your morning?" Tommy straightened at once. "All right, sir. Been telling folk what I heard, sir. Well, mostly." "Mostly?" The boy flushed. "Well, some of 'em ask questions what don't fit, sir, like whether she sounded foreign, or if she were crying. I just give 'em what's nearest, so they don't argue." Purbright regarded him with gentle patience. "A sensible strategy. But tell me, your own memory hasn't altered since last night?" "No, sir. I swear. Just the one voice. A lady. Not shouting exactly. Like she were trying to get someone's attention without a fuss." "A considerate ghost," Purbright murmured. Tommy looked alarmed until he caught the faint humour in the inspector's tone. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with the steady rhythm of speculation. People leaned closer over shopping baskets, voices dropping into confidential whispers. Theories gained detail. Details gained embellishment. A few residents even wandered by the clock tower in the hope of hearing something further, though the structure remained stubbornly mute. Yet beneath the town's feverish embroidery, Purbright sensed a quieter thread, one that ran not through rumour but through omissions. He noted, with the practiced ease of long observation, who had spoken too freely, who had spoken too little, and who had altered their account depending on audience. Miss Jory, the schoolteacher, had been notably absent from the morning's chorus. She had submitted a short, polite statement to Mally by telephone, repeating her claim of having been at home marking essays when the voice occurred. She offered no embellishments, no conjectures. For Flaxborough, such restraint was practically suspicious. Purbright filed this gently at the back of his mind. By late afternoon, the excitement had softened into a comfortable hum, like the residue of a strong cup of tea. The voice at midnight had already become part of the town's conversational furniture, a curiosity to be polished, repositioned, and marvelled at. But Purbright, strolling past the square once more as the new evening light settled against the tower's weathered bricks, found his attention lingering. The building stood as it always had, placid, unassuming, the perfect stage for drama only because its own character was so entirely absent. The inspector paused, hands resting lightly in his overcoat pockets. The quiet around him was complete. No whisper, no echo, no hint of a voice. Yet he could not shake the sense that the first act of something subtle had begun. And somewhere in the town, he was certain, someone else knew it too. Purbright began his inquiries the following morning with the quiet steadiness that Flaxborough had long mistaken for simplicity. It was a useful misconception, and he encouraged it with a gentle manner that invited confession rather than resistance. After all, most people in town were eager to speak. They merely needed to be heard in the correct sequence. He started with the first caller from the night before. Mrs. Perilous, a widow whose nerves were famously delicate and whose windows were kept perpetually ajar for the sake of circulation. She greeted the inspector in her front parlour with the air of someone who had suffered greatly and wished to suffer aloud. It was unmistakably a woman in fright, she declared, lowering herself into a chair upholstered in flowers that looked equally distressed. Though I will admit it was a cultured fright, none of your vulgar shrieking. Purbright nodded. You heard the voice only once? Oh no, twice. The second was fainter, as though the poor creature were being dragged away. This was curious, as no other caller had mentioned a second phrase. Purbright gently inquired whether any other noise accompanied it. Footsteps, for example, or movement in the square. Mrs. Perilous hesitated. Well, now that you mention it, there may have been footsteps, though they might have been my own imagination. She seemed so pleased with the usefulness of this imagination that Purbright refrained from further questions. He thanked her with a courtesy that made her feel she had contributed something valuable to the security of the town, and then stepped into the cool daylight, where gossip clung to the air like damp wool. His next visit was to the quiet terraced house of Miss Edna Jory, the schoolteacher. She answered her door with a reserved posture that suggested she disliked interruptions, even when they arrived politely dressed. I've already given my statement to the constable, she said, holding the door only halfway open. Yes, said Purbright, but I would appreciate hearing it in your own voice. Miss Jory's expression flickered at the word voice, though she quickly composed herself. She invited him into a sitting room with neatly arranged cushions and a smell of lavender, faint but unmistakable. I heard it while marking essays, she said, seating herself rigidly. It sounded plaintive, nothing more. I did not think it necessary to intrude further. Your window was open, only slightly. And the time? Just after midnight. I had been working since 10. She glanced at her writing desk, where papers lay stacked with judicial precision. The children's grammar is appalling these days. It takes considerable concentration. Purbright offered a sympathetic nod, though his attention lingered on the lavender scent. Something about it pulled faintly at the edge of memory. Not a conclusion, merely a marker. "Did you recognize the voice?" he asked. Miss Jory's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. "No, it was no one I know." It was the kind of answer that would have seemed unremarkable from anyone else, but her controlled tone carried an unusual weight. She appeared anxious to avoid elaboration, yet she was also too composed, not dismissive, not frightened, but calculating in what she chose not to say. Purbright did not press. Pressure often closed doors that would open naturally with time. He concluded the interview with a quiet thank you and left her to her papers. As he stepped back onto the street, he made a mental note. Miss Jory had altered nothing in her statement, yet her manner, unlike her words, suggested strain. His third conversation of the day was with Tommy Keever, again spotted during his deliveries. The boy, encouraged by the town's attention, now carried himself with the solemn pride of a witness in a major trial. "You're sure the voice came from the tower?" Purbright asked, walking with him for a few steps. "Certain, sir. It's hollow inside, see, so it kind of echoed." Tommy gestured with a crate for emphasis, nearly dropping a bottle. "And I saw Summit up there." Purbright paused. "Saw what, exactly?" Tommy swallowed. "A shadow, sort of moving. Not big, like a person bending." This contradicted his earlier claim of seeing nothing. Purbright asked gently, "Were you quite sure last night that you saw no one?" The boy shifted uneasily. "I didn't want folks saying I was making things up, sir. But the more I think on it, the more I reckon I did see something. Only for a second." It was possible. Children often recall truth wrapped in uncertainty. But it was equally possible that Tommy had been furnished with details by enthusiastic listeners who preferred more drama. Still, shadows did not move on their own. The tower, empty as it was, had nevertheless generated the illusion, or someone had been there long enough to create one. Purbright thanked him and continued toward the tower itself. The structure looked as it always had, tall, dull, faintly peeling, its clock face permanently fixed at 10 to 3, as though even time refused to run properly inside it. He walked around the base, examining the soil. Soft rain overnight had left the earth malleable. There were no clear footprints, though there were scuff marks on a patch of gravel near the western side, the kind that might be made by someone shifting a ladder or dragging something lightweight. He approached the door. The heavy bolt was secure, layered with rust, the padlock stiff but functional. He tugged it lightly. It did not budge. No sign of forced entry. But there was another hint, a faint imprint on the window ledge above, just beneath the narrow slit of an opening, the sort of place a person might rest an object briefly. He leaned closer, catching a faint trace of perfume. Lavender again. His next call was to Mr. Benedict Prime, the amateur radio enthusiast whom half the council had already begun blaming. Purbright found him in a cluttered shed packed with coiled wires, dismantled devices, and the perpetual smell of soldering. "Inspector, I haven't done anything," Prime exclaimed before Purbright had spoken. "I've made no accusations," Purbright replied mildly. "I merely wish to know whether you were operating any equipment last night." Prime shook his head vigorously. No, not at all. Electricity gives me palpitations. I only mend things, carefully. There were rumours, I know, but I shut everything down at 9. Ask my cat. Purbright did not consider the cat a credible witness, but Prime's anxiety appeared genuine. Nervous men rarely stage midnight theatrics involving women's voices. Did you hear anything unusual? He asked. Prime paused. Only the wind, and Mrs. Goffin arguing with her husband again. Nothing like a woman calling for help. Purbright took this in with calm consideration. Prime seemed less a suspect than a man easily suspected. By late afternoon, the inspector had collected enough fragments to form several incomplete possibilities. Each interview added something small: a hesitation, a slight contradiction, an omission. Nothing pointed to danger, not yet, but the lavender, the shadow, the tone of the voice, all hinted at design rather than accident. Returning to the station, he paused once more at the square. The tower loomed with its habitual indifference, yet Purbright's eye drifted upward. Something in the silence spoke more clearly than the voice itself had. Someone had gone to effort. Someone had chosen the time, the place, and the manner. And someone, he suspected, was waiting to see how the town would react. By the next morning, the town's need for an explanation had outpaced its need for accuracy. A culprit, any culprit, would do, provided he was sufficiently peculiar, suitably local, and incapable of mounting an impressive defense. Benedict Prime fit the bill with almost suspicious perfection. Purbright learned of the town's decision not from the man himself, but from Councillor Coxon, who intercepted him outside the station, wearing the self-satisfied expression of someone who believed he had solved a major crime before breakfast. "Inspector," Coxon announced, "I trust you've heard the latest. The mystery is practically resolved." Purbright doubted it, but allowed the councillor to continue. "It's Prime," Coxon said, lowering his voice as though imparting state secrets. "Benedict Prime. I've had 2 reliable reports that he was seen fiddling with one of his radio contraptions yesterday evening. Wires everywhere, apparently. Dangerous quantities of them." "Dangerous quantities of wires," Purbright repeated mildly. "How alarming." "Quite. And we all know he's been reprimanded before for errant frequencies. He was caught interfering with a shipping broadcast once. Or perhaps that was someone else. But the point stands." Purbright nodded, though the point, as presented, was more wobbly than standing. "And how?" he asked. "Does this relate to the voice heard last night?" Coxon brightened. "Why, he must have broadcast it, recorded it on one of those mechanical cylinders. He has all sorts of apparatus, speakers, coils, transmitters, the whole assortment, a menace with buttons." Purbright considered the image of Prime as an electronic mastermind, and found it rather at odds with the trembling, solder-stained man he had spoken to the previous afternoon. Prime had seemed frightened of his own plug sockets, let alone of staging a midnight performance. Still, suspicions, or what passed for them in Flaxborough, had acquired a foothold, and the footholds once gained were rarely relinquished. "Several townspeople are already convinced," Coxon continued. "If you act quickly, Inspector, we may prevent further nonsense." Purbright inclined his head with a polite neutrality that suggested neither agreement nor enthusiasm. "Thank you, Councillor. Your concern is noted." Once Coxon departed, radiating civic triumph, Purbright returned indoors to find Constable Malley staring at a small stack of new statements. "Another 3 this morning, sir," Malley reported. "All think Mr. Prime did it." "On what grounds?" "Well, mostly on account of him being odd." "I see." Malley looked faintly apologetic. "To be fair, sir, he is rather odd." Oddness is not in itself evidence, Purbright reminded gently. No, sir, but it does make the paperwork easier. Purbright smiled faintly. Life is rarely that convenient. He reviewed the statements. Each circled back to the same theme. Prime's reclusiveness, his mechanical hobby, his disconcerting habit of muttering about voltage. Not one statement contained an actual observation placing Prime near the tower. Several residents confidently cited reports that Prime had been heard tinkering late at night, though these reports appeared to originate from the same two people repeating each other. It was not that the theory was impossible, only that it was perfectly timed to distract from more troublesome possibilities. By midday, Purbright decided to pay Prime another visit. He found him seated outside his shed drinking tea from a chipped enamel mug and looking as though he had slept in his clothes for a week. "Inspector," Prime yelped, nearly spilling his tea. "I've done nothing additional since yesterday, I swear." "I haven't suggested you have," Purbright said calmly, "though the town seems eager to attribute last night's events to your expertise." "My expertise?" Prime blinked. "I haven't any. I only fix things that don't require electricity, or that require it only in theory." Purbright stepped inside the shed. The clutter was extensive, but nothing appeared new. No speaker cones, no large batteries, no devices capable of projecting a human voice across a square. Prime followed anxiously. "I haven't touched a transmitter since the business with the fishing trawler," Prime insisted. "And that was all an accident. I was trying to fix a heater." "I'm not accusing you," Purbright said, "but I would appreciate knowing whether you heard anything unusual last night." Prime hesitated. "I heard humming." "Humming?" "Yes, not electrical, human. A sort of melodic hum. But from outside, I thought it was Mrs. Goffin." Purbright considered this. "Did the humming stop before or after the voice was heard?" "Before," Prime said. "Some minutes before. I remember because I had just made tea, a strong cup." This detail was new. No one else had mentioned humming. "And where were you when you heard it?" Purbright asked. "In my kitchen, window open. The sound came from the square, I think." Purbright nodded. The conversation deepened a small but meaningful crease in his growing map of the night. Humming, then a voice. Someone preparing, someone rehearsing. Prime was almost certainly innocent, inconveniently so for those in search of convenience. When Purbright left the shed, the narrow lane was quiet except for the rustle of a newspaper caught on a hedge. He walked slowly, considering both the tidiness of the town's suspicion and its implausibility. When a theory fits too neatly, it often does so because someone has arranged it to. Back in the square, the clock tower kept its resolute silence. Miss Jory passed by on her way from the grocer's, carrying a small paper bag. She offered a polite nod. Her face seemed slightly drawn. "Good morning, Inspector," she said softly. "Good morning, Miss Jory. A busy day? A tedious one?" She hesitated, then added, "I suppose you've had no shortage of theories thrust upon you." "Quite a variety," Purbright agreed. "And you?" she asked. "Have you chosen one?" Purbright regarded her with quiet curiosity. "Not yet. I prefer to choose after the facts, not before them." Miss Jory smiled faintly, or perhaps not at all, and moved on. But Purbright watched her for a moment longer. A cautious woman, a controlled woman, a woman who disliked being observed. By late afternoon, news had spread that the inspector was investigating Prime closely, a statement which owed its accuracy entirely to the town's desire that it be true. Purbright knew better than to contradict them. False certainty served a purpose. It calmed the town, bought him time, and, most importantly, revealed who relaxed under the weight of a convenient suspect and who stiffened. And Miss Jory, he noted, had not relaxed at all. Convenience was seldom truth, and this suspect, presented with such communal eagerness, felt almost too neatly placed. By the following morning, Purbright found himself returning again and again to two small details that refused to sit comfortably among the others. The first concerned Miss Jory's calm insistence that she had been at home marking essays at the precise time the voice had drifted across the square. The second concerned Tommy Keever, who suddenly seemed rather more rehearsed in his recollection than a boy with only one honest memory ought to be. Neither detail was dramatic, both were persistent, and Purbright had learned long ago that persistence, in small things, often indicated inconvenience for someone. He brought out the brief note of Miss Jory's gas meter reading, acquired as part of the routine inquiry that accompanied any late-night report. It was the constable's handwriting, clear and unadorned. No recorded usage between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. For a woman who had claimed to mark essays until well past midnight in the early spring, the absence of heat or lamp usage was curious. Not impossible, merely improbable. He mentioned this to Mally, who frowned at the notion of anyone voluntarily sitting in the cold to correct schoolwork. "Perhaps she marks by candle, sir," he suggested hopefully. Purbright allowed the thought to settle, though he suspected Miss Jory would treat an open flame with the same cautious respect she afforded any student wielding a fountain pen. The lavender scent lingering in her parlour had also been too deliberate. Not overpowering, but placed, much like her explanations. He decided to speak again with Tommy Keever, but not in the open street where the boy was constantly interrupted by neighbours eager to reenact the mystery for him. He found Tommy near the stables behind Dixon's dairy, where the boy was sorting bottles. The morning was grey and mild. The scent of hay mingled with cream. There were fewer distractions here, fewer eager listeners waiting to influence the boy's recollection. "Tommy," Purbright said gently, "I've been thinking about what you told me." The boy brightened at first, then dimmed. "I said it right, didn't I, sir?" "You said what you believed," Purbright replied, which was true enough. "But I wonder, did anyone speak to you last night before you told me about the shadow in the tower?" Tommy's ears reddened. He shifted one foot, then the other. "Might have been someone, sir." "Someone who gave you a threepence?" Purbright asked mildly. Tommy froze, eyes widening. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "A lady. Said I ought to mention the tower, sir. Said folks wouldn't believe me otherwise. A kind lady. She were polite enough. Didn't give her name. Just pressed the coin in me hand and said it were important I tell it proper." "Did she describe what you should say?" "Only that I'd heard the voice come from up there. I didn't lie about hearing it, sir, I swear." Purbright believed him. Tommy's imagination was capable of ornamentation, but bribery tended to produce a different sort of embellishment, a careful one, meant not to disappoint whoever had paid for it. "Did you see her face?" Purbright asked. "Not clearly. She kept the hood of her coat up. But she smelled nice, like them little purple flowers. Lavender." "Aye, that's it." Purbright thanked him and let him return to his crates, though the boy now seemed relieved, as though a weight had been eased simply by telling the truth aloud. Purbright, on the other hand, felt the weight transfer neatly into his own pocket. Lavender again. Always lavender. The second errand was to the tower itself. He walked there at midday, when the square was at its busiest, and the tower at its most ignored. The townspeople passed it daily without ever really looking at it, which made it the ideal place to hide anything that relied on being both visible and unseen at once. The structure, weathered and stubborn, cast a firm shadow across the cobbles. Its locked door remained unchanged, its rusted bolt undisturbed. But Purbright did not linger at the door. He circled to the western side, where he had noticed the scuffed gravel. He crouched, examining the faint marks. They were too slight for a ladder, but entirely consistent with something being dragged briefly. Perhaps a crate, perhaps a stool, perhaps nothing more significant than a careless foot. Yet the pattern was deliberate. Someone had stood here for a length of time. He rose slowly and looked upward again at the small window slit. It was barely large enough for a hand, certainly not large enough for a device of any size. But the ledge beneath it bore a faint smear, as though something with weight had been rested there. He inhaled. The lavender was weaker here, dissipated by wind, but not gone. Returning to the station, he found Mally writing up the morning's activity with such enthusiasm that it resembled an epic saga. Mally looked up eagerly. "Any progress, sir?" "Some," Purbright said, removing his coat. "Did you, by chance, speak again with Miss Jory?" "No, sir. Should I?" "Not yet." He paused. "But when you next see her, Mally, observe how she answers simple questions. Not what she says, how she says it." Mally blinked. "Tone, sir." "Tone is everything," Purbright murmured. After a moment of thought, he added, "And Mally, if she should mention her sister, even in passing, take note." Her sister had not appeared in any statement or any town conversation. Yet Purbright had observed the neat arrangement of photographs on her mantelpiece the day before. Her parents, herself at university, a faded holiday snapshot of two girls standing beside a caravan. Only one of those girls was accounted for in Miss Jory's account of her evening. That absence, like the lavender, would not sit still. By late afternoon, the weather turned clear and cool. The town resumed its ordinary rhythms: errands, deliveries, gentle quarrels over apples that were either too soft or too firm. Purbright strolled across Market Row, allowing the day's details to settle into their quiet positions. No revelation had struck him, no melodramatic shift in the case. Just two small facts, refusing to behave as they should. Miss Jory, who had every reason to be unremarkable, had made herself conspicuously precise. Tommy Keever had been nudged gently toward the tower by a woman with lavender on her coat, and somewhere between them lay the truth's smallest hinge, the detail out of place that would allow the rest to turn. For now, it remained only a hinge, silent and unassuming. But hinges, Purbright knew, were designed to move when the right pressure was applied. The following days brought neither new voices nor new clarity, but instead a slow unwinding of people, as though the midnight disturbance had loosened threads long held tight. Old grievances surfaced with renewed vigour. Strangers arrived with peculiar timing, and those who ordinarily lived with comfortable anonymity found themselves under uninvited scrutiny. Purbright moved through these developments with the kind of patience that suggested he was not merely gathering facts, but observing how the town arranged itself when unsettled. Disturbances, he believed, rarely produced new truths. They simply revealed old ones. The first revelation came from the town library, where the visiting archivist, Mr. Lionel, forborn, had stationed himself for a fortnight to catalogue municipal documents no one had requested he examine. He was tall, angular, and perpetually dusted with the scent of old paper. A man who appeared to have stepped straight out of the records he adored. He approached Purbright one morning with a sheaf of papers clutched as though they were ransom demands. "Inspector, forgive the intrusion, but I must inform you of an irregularity concerning the clock tower." His voice carried the earnest fretfulness of someone who feared being ignored more than being wrong. "I've been reviewing structural records from the 20s. Several repairs were made after a minor collapse within the internal staircase. It seems the tower's interior was boarded off, not merely abandoned." "Boarded off?" Purbright echoed. "Not simply locked?" "No, sealed," Forborn insisted. "It could not be accessed from the inside without considerable effort, which means if someone were inside recently, they either broke in or already had a means of entry." "That is helpful," Purbright said, though his tone remained mild. The archivist, rather proud, straightened at once, as though he had delivered a decisive clue rather than an architectural anecdote. More curious was the timing of the man's arrival in Flaxborough. Travelling archivists were rare creatures. Ones arriving precisely when a public monument became the centre of gossip were rarer still. Purbright tucked the thought neatly away, without drawing conclusions. Later that afternoon, while passing down Fenmarket Lane, Purbright encountered a woman whose face struck him with the force of a half-remembered tune. She stood outside a modest lodging house, signing a small ledger held by the landlady. Her posture was firm, her expression brisk, and though she was dressed plainly, there was a tension beneath her composure that suggested she had been avoiding recognition. When she turned, Purbright knew why the sight of her had pricked something familiar. She was unmistakably related to Miss Jory. The resemblance was softened by difference. Where Miss Jory was angular and reserved, this woman held herself with defensive impatience, as though the world had long mistaken her intentions. They shared the same pale eyes, the same narrow features. The landlady waved at Purbright. "Inspector, come to see your new visitor. She's just arrived this morning, poor thing." The woman stiffened. "I'm no visitor, only passing through." Purbright offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon. I believe I've met your sister." "My sister?" The woman blinked too quickly. "I don't have a sister." The denial was so abrupt, so unnecessary, that it might as well have been an admission. "Ah," Purbright said gently. "I must have mistaken you then. A natural error." She said nothing more, but the landlady filled the silence with cheerful obliviousness. "She's taken the top room for a few nights. Quiet lass. Keeps to herself." The woman's gaze flicked to Purbright, wary, assessing whether he had noticed her unease. He had, though he gave no outward sign. She left with a small suitcase, walking quickly toward the square, her steps betraying urgency rather than leisure. It was an interesting addition to the puzzle. A sister who did not exist, according to herself, and yet shared a face too similar to deny convincingly. And she carried herself with the unmistakable posture of someone returning to settle something left unresolved. Evening brought a second thread of intrigue, courtesy of the council clerk, Mr. Fenimore, who caught Purbright near the town hall with the solemnity of a man about to confess to something largely administrative. "Inspector, I hesitate to bring up old matters, but, well, you ought to know there's been tension between Miss Jory and her family, particularly her younger sister." He cleared his throat. "Some inheritance matter, not a fortune, mind you, a modest sum from their late mother. But feelings, as you know, can be disproportionately attached to modest sums." "What form did this tension take?" Purbright asked. "Oh, letters," Fenimore said vaguely. "Quite sharp ones, I gather. And Miss Jory was deeply upset last year when the sister left town unexpectedly. She told the vicar the girl had gone to stay with a cousin in Derby, but no cousin was ever confirmed. Interesting, Purbright murmured. It was the perfect word. Not accusatory, not dismissive, simply receptive. As Fenimore shuffled away, Purbright watched the slow rearrangement of facts forming around him. A sister absent without acknowledgement. A tower that could not be entered without planning. Lavender in too many places. A milk boy gently guided toward a particular narrative. A woman's voice, deliberate rather than desperate. He walked on, stopping briefly near the Blue Cobbler. The landlord leaned in the doorway smoking his evening cigarette, nodding toward the inspector as though they were participants in the same long-running play. "Had a chap in here last night," Rudge announced without preamble. "Said he heard a woman's voice weeks ago, down by the river. Didn't think much of it at the time, but after the business with the tower, he decided it were relevant." "Did he describe the voice?" "Soft," Rudge said. "Sad, like she were calling someone by name, only he couldn't make out who. Another echo, another place, yet the same shape. Flaxborough, though fond of embellishment, rarely produced coincidental harmonies. Repeated incidents, separated by time and place, suggested intention." As dust settled, Purbright walked slowly toward the riverbank, where the earlier incident had allegedly occurred. The water was calm, the reeds shifting gently in the breeze. Nothing unusual lingered here now. No footprints, no trampled grass, no trace of lavender. But the quiet had a texture that felt familiar, as though the air still remembered what had been heard. He stood a moment, hands clasped behind his back, letting thought, not deduction, guide him. There was someone in Flaxborough who desired an audience. Someone who understood how sound travelled, how rumour blossomed, how fear sharpened attention. Someone old enough to hold a grievance and young enough to carry it out with invention. A sister, perhaps, or someone connected to her. The pieces were not ready to assemble, not yet. But they were gathering, moving of their own accord toward a shape that would soon refuse to remain hidden. And Purbright, watching the quiet river, sensed that the next movement would not wait long. The second disturbance came 2 nights after the archivist's revelation, at a time when the town had almost settled back into its habitual rhythm of mild suspicion and milder exaggeration. Had the new incident occurred at midday, it might have been folded neatly into conversation and diluted by daylight. But it happened again at night, and Flaxborough, when roused after dark, had a habit of reacting as though the veil between the ordinary and the catastrophic were alarmingly thin. Purbright was at home, halfway through a tepid pot of tea and an article on municipal drainage, when the station telephone rang with a shrillness that suggested the caller was holding the receiver too tightly. He listened, said 6 calm words in reply, and was out of the house within a minute. By the time he reached the riverbank, Constable Malley was already there, panting slightly and shining his torch in broad, dramatic sweeps that illuminated nothing except startled reeds. "Footprints, sir," Malley gasped, and a cry. Several folk heard it clear as a bell. A woman calling out, same as before. "Not the same," Purbright corrected gently. "Different location, different timing." "What exactly did the witnesses say?" Malley consulted his notebook, which was damp around the edges. "Mrs. Dovely heard it while closing her shutters. Said it was a proper cry this time. Frightened. Mr. Hapgood heard it next. Claimed it echoed across the water, and young Alan Pike insists it came from right down here by the bend." Purbright nodded, scanning the bank. The air had the cold stillness of late evening, the kind that held sound like breath. The moon threw a diluted glow over the water, flattening shadows but sharpening edges. The cry, whatever it had been, was no longer repeating. Purbright crouched near the soft patch of earth Mally had indicated. The footprints were faint but real, a set of light impressions, narrow and pointed, the sort made by a small or careful foot. Beside them, pressed half into the mud, lay a crushed sprig of lavender. He lifted it gently. The scent was weakened by moisture but unmistakable. Lavender again, repeating itself like a signature. "Fresh," he murmured. Mally, who took this as confirmation of something, urgent, said, "You think she were here, sir? Properly here?" "Someone was," Purbright said. "At least long enough to leave a message." "A message, sir?" Purbright showed him the lavender. Mally blinked at it as though it might explode. "Flowers now," he said. "Voices one night, flowers the next. What do you make of it?" "I try not to make anything too quickly," Purbright replied. "The facts will object." More residents arrived, forming a polite cluster at the edge of the bank. Mrs. Dovely wrapped her shawl tightly, her expression torn between dread and satisfaction. "It were awful, Inspector," she said breathlessly. "A cry, proper desperate, like someone calling to Lord himself." Mr. Hapgood, whose hearing was famously selective, added, "Echoed odd, it did, not natural, like from under the water, could be a warning." Young Alan Pike tried to look worldly as he declared, "I saw someone running, Inspector. Right that way." He pointed vaguely upstream. Purbright turned to him. "You saw a person?" Alan hesitated. "Well, I saw summit moving. Could have been a fox. Or a shadow," Purbright said gently. "Or a shadow," Alan agreed at once, grateful for the amendment. "Did anyone," Purbright asked the group, "see or hear humming before the cry? A tune, perhaps?" They exchanged puzzled glances. No, no humming this time. Only the cry, sharp and singular. Purbright thanked them with a calmness that softened their alarm. The group dispersed reluctantly, casting backward glances as though expecting the voice to return the moment they left. When the crowd thinned, Purbright walked slowly along the river's bend. The bank curved inward, creating a natural pocket where sound could carry strangely. A deliberate person might use such a place to create the illusion of distance or distress. He crouched again, studying the ground. The footprints did not lead anywhere. They simply appeared and vanished, as though the person had approached from solid ground and then stepped carefully backward into the reeds to hide their retreat. Mally joined him a moment later, torch angled downward. "Seems planned, sir. Whoever it were, they came to be heard." "Yes," Purbright said softly. "Heard, but not seen." "And not found," Mally added. "Not yet," Purbright agreed. "But they left something new." He held up the sprig again. Mally stared at it as though encountering evidence for the first time in his career. "You think it's the same person as before?" Purbright considered the question. "The same mind, certainly. The same intention." He stepped back and surveyed the area, noting the subtle way the trees framed the scene, creating a sense of seclusion, while still offering the perfect vantage point for someone to watch how people reacted. "Sir," Mally said, voice lowered, "do you reckon someone's in danger, properly in danger?" Purbright did not answer immediately. He weighed the lavender, the footprints, the rehearsed cry, the absent sister, the woman with the hurried denial. A pattern was forming, elegant, deliberate, but incomplete. "I believe," he said carefully, "that someone wishes us to think so." The constable frowned. "But why put fright into the whole town?" "That," Purbright said, "is the question we must now ask." Before leaving the riverbank, he paused once more, allowing the memory of the first incident to settle alongside this second one. 2 voices, 2 locations, 2 nights apart. The first carefully measured, the second more dramatic. Whoever had staged them was escalating or refining. Someone was guiding the town's imagination like a hand steering a candle flame. He returned to the station just after midnight, writing a brief note summarizing the scene. His final sentence was understated, but to him it carried the weight of certainty. The second disturbance confirms intention. Pattern emerging. Watch Miss Jory, her sister, and any who linger near water or tower. He closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and sat a moment longer in the darkness, listening. Nothing moved outside. Yet Purbright felt the quiet in Flaxborough had shifted again. Stretched thinner, tightened in places, warped at its edges. And somewhere he knew the person behind the voice was waiting for the town to hear something else. Something next. Something nearer to the truth. Purbright rose the next morning with the peculiar clarity that follows a night of mild sleep and persistent thoughts. The second disturbance had not startled him. Nothing quite startled Purbright, but it had settled into his mind with the quiet insistence of something deliberately unfinished. The lavender, the rehearsed cry, the narrow footprints by the riverbank. They were no longer isolated curiosities. They were choices, and choices once made suggested intent. He walked to the station shortly after 8, the town only beginning to stir. Early shopkeepers swept their doorways with the resigned vigour of people who expected dust and gossip in equal measure. Those who noticed the inspector gave him the kind of greeting that hovered between hope and dread, as though he might at any moment announce that the mystery was solved, or worse, that it had deepened. Both, in their own way, were true. Inside the station, Mally awaited him with the conscientious earnestness of someone who feared he might have missed an important detail in the night. "No new reports since midnight, sir," he said. "Folk are still rattled. Mrs. Dovely says she won't step near the river again without a companion." "That precaution," Purbright replied, removing his coat, "is unlikely to inconvenience the river." Mally nodded solemnly, uncertain whether this was humour or regulation. Purbright took his seat, opened his notebook, and allowed his thoughts to settle like sediment in clear water. There was a rhythm to the disturbances. Not predictable, perhaps, but intentional. Someone wanted the town's attention pulled toward the idea of peril. Not actual peril, but the shape of it. A voice in distress, a cry near water, the faint perfume of a woman whose presence was suggested rather than proved. Flaxborough's imagination had done the rest, embroidering fear into the air with cooperative enthusiasm. But not everyone embroidered. Some stitched too precisely. He turned a page and began listing names, writing each with deliberate slowness. Miss Edna Jory, the unnamed sister who claimed not to be a sister. Benedict Prime, not because he believed Prime guilty, but because Prime's innocence had arrived too conveniently. Mr. Forborn, the archivist, whose arrival in town had aligned just so with the tower's sudden prominence. The landlord of the Blue Cobbler, whose recollections were suspiciously flexible. Mrs. Dovely, whose account had improved in pathos each time she told it. Each name had a thread attached, but only one thread tugged back. Miss Jory, her careful politeness, her consistent restraint, her rigidly stated alibi that did not fully align with her gas meter, her denial of anything unusual, paired with her heightened composure. And now the arrival of someone who resembled her too closely to be an unrelated stranger. Two sisters, one missing from public mention, the other quietly avoiding explanation. Lavender in multiple places. A voice staged with care. A cry by the river that mimicked danger without producing it. Purbright leaned back, the chair creaking as though agreeing with him. There was something fundamentally human at the center of this. Not malice precisely, but a tangled knot of emotion. Guilt, perhaps, or fear of discovery, or longing wrapped in misdirection. Flaxborough, he reflected, was a town where grievances fermented gently, building flavor with age. People rarely confronted one another directly. They preferred the polite cruelty of omission, of sidelong hints, of unresolved quarrels left to cool and then reheat themselves at inconvenient times. A missing sister was precisely the kind of unresolved matter that could set such things in motion. He rose and walked to the window. The square lay visible from here, the clock tower rising from its center like a monument to something the town had forgotten it once cared about. The structure itself had no interest in voices or lavender, yet it had twice been selected as a stage, a place visible to all, tended by none, and overlooked in its familiarity. A place where a performance could unfold without witnesses, yet be heard by many. A place to draw attention. His gaze drifted toward the river road, visible just beyond the rooftops. The second disturbance had not replaced the first. It had complemented it. The voice had moved, from near the tower to near the river, as though the hand directing these moments was adjusting the scenery for the next act. And what was the next act? Purbright suspected it would not involve voices alone. He returned to his desk. Mally, observing his thoughtful quiet, finally asked, "If you don't mind me saying, sir, you look like you've reached a notion." "A notion," Purbright said, "is simply a thought wearing a disguise. I prefer to catch it before it changes clothes." Mally blinked. "Yes, sir." "Tell me, Mally," Purbright continued, "when you interviewed Miss Jory the first time, did she mention her family at all?" "No, sir, not a word." "And yesterday, at the riverbank, did she appear among the crowd?" "No, sir, didn't see her." Purbright nodded. People often reveal much by absence. Mally frowned as though attempting to reconcile this with the visible facts. "And her sister," Purbright added lightly. "Did you happen to see her this morning? The woman lodging on Fenmarket Lane?" Mally shook his head. "Not yet, sir." "Keep an eye out then, casually. She seems inclined to keep herself unseen when possible." Mally nodded with renewed seriousness, as though embarking on a covert operation of national significance. When he had gone, Purbright sat again, folding his hands loosely. There was a gentleness in his contemplation, like that of a man considering a fragile object. He felt no irritation with those responsible, only a quiet curiosity as to what pain or secret had driven them toward such theatrics. Human motives, he reflected, were remarkably consistent across time. People feared loss, loved unevenly, sought attention in muddled ways, hid missteps with elaborate performances. Truth itself was rarely complicated, only the route by which people attempted to avoid it. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the puzzle settle. A woman's voice, staged with precision. Lavender, marking movement. Footprints without a path. A sister who claimed not to be. A town ready to believe anything except simplicity. Someone was shaping a narrative, and they were doing it with care, but also desperation. The river cry, more dramatic than the first voice, hinted at urgency. It was as though the unseen hand behind these events was escalating, trying to force the town toward a discovery that had not yet materialized. Not danger, not deception, not malice, attention. Someone wanted the town, or perhaps Purbright himself, to look somewhere specific. He opened his eyes. The quiet of the station felt momentarily deeper, as though waiting. Whatever came next, he knew, would not be subtle. The pattern demanded its next movement, and someone in Flaxborough was already preparing the stage. Purbright straightened slowly, readying himself for the moment when subtle hints would give way to something sharper. The voice had spoken twice. It would not remain silent long. Purbright waited until late afternoon before deciding the moment was right. Timing, in his view, was the least appreciated aspect of police work, particularly in a town where people revealed more by habit than by confession. Miss Jory, for instance, was a creature of steady rhythms. She returned from school at precisely 4:30, paused at the gate to check her post, and then entered her house with the faintly weary determination of someone making a daily peace with responsibility. Today, she followed that pattern exactly. And because predictability offered the warm illusion of safety, Purbright chose that moment to disrupt it. Not with accusation, but with conversation. He approached as she sorted through 2 envelopes, both addressed in the tidy cursive of parents' handwriting. She looked up, startled only for a heartbeat, before restoring her usual composure. "Inspector," she greeted, managing a polite smile. "Is there some new development?" "Only in understanding," Purbright replied pleasantly. "May I trouble you for a few minutes?" She glanced at the envelopes, weighing excuses, then stepped aside to let him in. Her sitting room was exactly as before, orderly, faintly perfumed with lavender, and arranged with an almost symmetrical precision. People often revealed themselves in how they managed their rooms, and Miss Jory managed hers with the care of someone maintaining boundaries rather than comfort. "Tea?" she asked. "Only if it's no trouble." "It's never trouble." Yet the way she moved suggested she would have preferred any other visitor. Still, she fetched the pot, prepared the tray, and set everything down with meticulous quiet. Purbright waited until she had taken her seat. "Miss Jory," he began mildly, "I find myself curious about something you mentioned the other day." "Yes." "You said you'd been marking essays at the time of the first disturbance. A late task." Her expression did not change, but a stiffness settled in her shoulders. "It was a long day. I was behind." "Understandable," Purbright said. "Children have an impressive ability to generate paperwork." She offered a faint laugh, the kind produced for politeness rather than amusement. "Of course," Purbright continued gently, "marking does require good lighting. Even the best eyes need help at that hour." "Indeed." "And yet your gas meter," he said, pausing to stir his tea with mild interest, "shows no usage that night." The room remained still. The quiet held its breath. Miss Jory met his gaze with admirable poise. "Gas meters can be unreliable." "So I've heard," Purbright said, "though not often from someone as attentive as you." He let that rest a moment. "Tell me, have you ever performed on stage, Miss Jory?" The question landed like a pebble dropped into a perfectly calm pool. A small sound, a widening ripple. "No," she said. Too quickly. "Ah," Purbright murmured. "Forgive me. It's only that your voice carries well. One might imagine you capable of projecting it across a square if you wished." Her hands closed gently around her teacup. "I don't know what you're implying." "Implying," Purbright echoed, as though puzzled. "Nothing at all. Only that projection is a skill, and skills are rarely accidental." She looked down at her cup, then up again, composing herself. "Inspector, I truly do not know what you expect from me." "Very little," Purbright said kindly. only honesty in small things. The words had no accusation in them, yet something in her expression faltered. Not fear exactly, more a weariness, as though he had brushed a wound she had been trying not to acknowledge. He did not press. Instead, he shifted with the ease of someone changing topics. "I met a woman recently," he said. "A visitor staying on Fenmarket Lane. She resembles you, remarkably so." Miss Jory's breath caught, almost but not quite audible. "There are many resemblances among people." "True," Purbright agreed, "though not all of them deny their own families." Silence again. Not brittle this time, but heavy. Purbright's tone remained gentle. "You haven't mentioned your sister." Miss Jory stood abruptly and crossed to the mantel, adjusting a small framed photograph that did not need adjusting. "I don't see why I should." "Because," Purbright said softly, "she appears to be in town, and she left in haste once she saw me." Miss Jory's hand remained on the frame, fingertips resting on the glass. Her back was straight, her posture rigid, but her voice, when it came, trembled only at the edges. "My sister and I," she said quietly, "have not been on good terms." "No," Purbright said. "I gathered as much. Letters unreturned, an inheritance unsettled." She turned then, expression tight. "You've no right to pry into my family." "Quite right," he said, "and I haven't. Your neighbours did that for me." A flicker of exasperated resignation crossed her face, the look of someone betrayed by the fundamental unkindness of communal curiosity. Purbright softened his tone. "Miss Jory, this is not about blame. It is about understanding." She closed her eyes for a moment. "What is it you wish to understand?" He set down his cup. Whether the voice that night was an attempt to be heard, or an attempt to make someone else be found. For a heartbeat, she froze, not startled, wounded. It was a recognition too deep for pretense. Purbright rose, but without interruption, without threat. He stepped toward the door. "Thank you for the tea," he said gently. "A lovely brew." She did not answer. She stood in the same rigid posture as he let himself out. The cool air outside pressed around him in a soft embrace. He did not look back at her window, though he sensed she stood behind it, watching, her thoughts racing like trapped birds. He walked toward the square, where dusk was beginning to settle, casting the tower in long shadow. From a short distance away, he saw a movement in an alcove, someone slipping quietly from view. The sister, perhaps, or someone sent to watch. Purbright paused only a moment before continuing. His nudge had landed. Not a push, only the lightest pressure. Enough to disturb a balance, enough to reveal where the cracks already lay. The next move, he knew, would not come from him. The next move would come from whoever had something left to hide, or something left to reveal. The following afternoon, Purbright requested the use of the council reading room, a place so rarely occupied that even the dust seemed surprised when the door opened. Its tall windows let in a pale, diffused light, illuminating shelves of municipal histories that no one had touched in 20 years. A long table stood at the centre, polished to the point of reflection, and it was here that Purbright positioned 3 chairs, with the careful neutrality of a man arranging a polite conversation rather than an interrogation. He had asked Miss Jory to attend. She had agreed only after a long moment of hesitation, during which she seemed to weigh not the inspector's authority, but the fragility of whatever truth she was protecting. Her sister had been more difficult to locate, but not difficult to persuade. She arrived looking wary, defensive, and tired in the way only long avoidance can make a person tired. Prime, invited as a courtesy to dispel the town's lingering suspicions, entered last. He sat gingerly, as though afraid he might be blamed for the condition of the furniture. Purbright remained standing for a moment, allowing the silence to arrange itself around them. "Thank you all for coming," he said mildly. "I realize this situation has created some discomfort. That was not my intention, though it appears someone else intended precisely that." Miss Jory shifted, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Her sister, who still refused to give her name, stared fixedly at a point on the table, jaw set. Purbright continued, his tone unhurried. "Flaxborough, as you know, has always possessed a remarkable imagination, especially when given a little encouragement." He rested his fingertips on the back of a chair. The midnight voice at the tower, the cry by the river. These were not accidents. They were staged. Prime inhaled sharply, looking around as if for an exit. "Inspector, I swear." "I know," Purbright said gently. "You were not responsible. Your equipment is in no condition to frighten even a timid sparrow." Prime sagged with relief. Purbright turned his attention to the two sisters. "The key to the matter," he said, "is not who performed the voice, though that part is relatively clear. But why?" Miss Jory closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself against a truth long delayed. Purbright pulled from his coat a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table, unwrapped it, and revealed a compact, portable gramophone. Old, worn, but functional. This, he said, was tucked behind the outer stones of the clock tower, dry, protected, and with just enough winding left for a short performance. He tapped the edge lightly. It contains a recording, a woman's voice, pleading, melodic, unmistakably chosen for its ability to carry. The unnamed sister shifted as though nudged by an invisible hand. "And," Purbright continued, "another device, very similar, was found this morning near the riverbank, buried lightly in the reeds. Its mechanism was damp, but still intact enough to show it had been operated recently. Both devices carried the faint scent of lavender." He paused. A scent present in only two places, Miss Jory's parlour, and on the coat of the woman who bribed Tommy Keever. Miss Jory opened her eyes. They were bright with strain, but no longer guarded. Purbright stepped closer to the table. "A voice staged once may be imagination. Staged twice is intent. And staged with lavender in both locations suggests a deliberate signature, one that mattered personally to the person responsible." He looked between the sisters. "Your mother wore lavender, did she not?" The unnamed sister's composure cracked first. Her breath trembled. She leaned back in her chair as though the memory pressed upon her physically. Miss Jory spoke, her voice thin. "Inspector, please don't." He nodded gently. "I believe you know this cannot remain unspoken." The sister buried her face in her hands. Miss Jory glanced at her, then at Purbright, and something inside her steadied, as though the moment she had dreaded had also become the moment she needed. "She left," Miss Jory said quietly. "My sister. She left after an argument, a foolish one, the kind that grows sharper than it deserves because people are too alike to give way. She swallowed, and when she did not return, I could not explain it, not without saying too much, not without admitting that I had pushed too hard." Sister lifted her head, eyes rimmed red. "You didn't push. I ran. I ran because I couldn't bear the house after Mother died. I thought I'd come back when I could face it." Her voice wavered, but I waited too long. Miss Jory closed her eyes again, as if absorbing both accusation and absolution. Purbright took his seat now, folding his hands calmly. "You returned last week," he said to the younger woman. "But instead of approaching your sister, you took a room on Fenmarket Lane. Why?" "Because I didn't know how to walk back into her life." She shook her head. "I thought she wouldn't want me, that she'd made her peace with me being gone." Miss Jory turned toward her, pain flickering through her expression. "I never wanted you gone." The younger woman laughed weakly. "You wrote as if you did." Miss Jory said nothing for a long moment. Then softly, "I wrote as I thought she would have written." She nodded toward the gramophone. "And I spoke as I thought she would have spoken, because I didn't know how else to say I was sorry." A silence settled, heavy, aching, but no longer evasive. Purbright let it breathe before speaking. "Miss Jory, you created the voice at the tower." "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I recorded it. I used a line Mother used to say when calling us in from the garden. I wanted my sister to hear it. I wanted her to know I still remembered, and that I was looking for her." "And the second disturbance," Purbright continued. "The cry by the river?" The younger sister answered. "That was me. I saw you," she said to Purbright. "I saw you leaving our conversation the other day, and I realized she was reaching out. I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I echoed her voice in a different place, you'd put the pieces together faster. I didn't want her blamed." A peculiar softness crossed Miss Jory's face, the expression of someone who had long feared rejection and now found it reflected back as concern rather than anger. Purbright exhaled slowly. So the two events were not acts of malice, nor attempts to mislead the town dangerously. They were attempts to reach one another. Misguided, perhaps. Misplaced, certainly. He allowed a faint smile, but not criminal in intent. Prime, who had been sitting rigidly throughout, suddenly relaxed so quickly he nearly toppled from his chair. "Oh, thank heavens," he murmured. Purbright stood. "There will be a formal caution, Miss Jory, for the disturbances and for involving a child. And a word with you," he added to the younger sister, "about late-night dramatics. But neither of you will face charges. You have caused alarm, yes, but harm. Only to yourselves, I think." The sisters exchanged a look, one layered with regret, relief, and something like the fragile beginning of reconciliation. Purbright gathered the gramophone and rewrapped it carefully. Before leaving, he turned back to them with quiet warmth. "Flaxborough," he said, "has always been a place where whispers grow into legends. Be grateful your story will be remembered only as a mystery, not a tragedy." Miss Jory lowered her head. Her sister reached for her hand, and for the first time, neither pulled away. The case, Purbright knew, was ending, but the mending, that would take longer. Still, it had finally begun. The disturbances, having provided the town with more than enough conversational nourishment, began dissolving almost at once the truth was known. Or at least, once Purbright chose to share the digestible portion of it. Flaxborough preferred mysteries only so long as they remained comfortably unsolved. Actual explanations were treated as mildly impolite intrusions into the delightful work of speculation. Thus, when Purbright issued his brief statement that the voices were the result of a private family matter now resolved, and that no danger had ever been present, disappointment fluttered quietly through Market Row like a deflated banner. But relief quickly replaced it. People regained their appetite for errands, for mild gossip, for the agreeable hum of daily habit. The clock tower, which had enjoyed a sudden surge in popularity over the last week, returned swiftly to its natural state of being ignored. The riverbank, too, reclaimed its anonymity, though Mrs. Dovely continued to avoid it with theatrical caution, which she insisted was not fear, merely prudence. This prudence extended to keeping her shutters firmly closed after dusk, which conveniently prevented her from hearing anything that might contradict her retelling of events. Miss Jory and her sister were seen together the following morning, walking along Fenmarket Lane in slow, tentative steps. The sight of them, shoulders almost but not quite touching, created a brief ripple of curiosity among the townspeople. But when asked directly, Miss Jory offered a polite, pared-down explanation about an overdue visit and family matters now properly attended to, which satisfied everyone except those intent on being dissatisfied. Her sister left on the afternoon bus, pausing only to exchange a quiet glance with Purbright as he passed the station. It was not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent. Acknowledgement, perhaps, that he had intervened with gentleness rather than force. She lifted her small suitcase and boarded without looking back. Miss Jory watched from a distance, her expression unreadable but relieved of its earlier strain. Even Councillor Coxon, who had prepared himself to claim victory through his preferred suspect Prime, was forced to swallow an explanation that lacked electronic devices, oscillating frequencies, or delinquent youth. He amended his stance quickly. I suspected from the first, he told two shopkeepers, that this was an interpersonal matter. One can always tell. Tone of the voice, don't you know? No one challenged him. It was simpler to let him have the triumph. Prime himself regained his equilibrium with characteristic fragility. After being reassured that he would not be blamed for anything involving wires, batteries, or the terrifying field of acoustics, he resumed repairing harmless objects in his shed. His cat regarded him with renewed suspicion, but otherwise all was well. The archivist, Mr. Forbourne, returned to his documents with a zeal that suggested relief at being freed from association with anything dramatic. He did, however, take the opportunity to detail the structural deficiencies of the clock tower to anyone who would listen, which fortunately was very few people. Life, in short, slipped smoothly back into place, a place Flaxborough preferred, orderly, predictable, faintly eccentric, and undemanding. Purbright, for his part, completed the necessary paperwork in the same steady hand with which he approached everything. His report was thorough but unadorned, leaving aside the emotional complexities that had shaped the case. Official forms were seldom improved by human nuance. When he had signed the final page, he sat back, letting the soft afternoon light settle across his desk. Outside, the square moved through its familiar rhythm. Bicycles passing, a delivery cart stopping outside the baker's, the faint clatter of crates from Dixon's dairy. The clock tower, unbothered by the recent attention, cast its usual indolent shadow. Mally entered with a cup of tea, placing it before him with pride. "Quiet afternoon, sir." "As it should be," Purbright replied. "Quiet is good for Flaxborough." "Aye, though folk do say it was quite the adventure." "Folk," Purbright said dryly, "say many things." Mally grinned, uncertain whether he was allowed to laugh. Purbright spared him the decision by returning to his paperwork, allowing the constable to drift back to his own duties. When the station had settled into its gentle end-of-day hum, Purbright rose and strolled to the window. The air outside held the faint, promising warmth of early spring. A few townspeople crossed the square with evening errands, oblivious now to the shadows where they had once expected phantom voices. He thought of the two sisters, their quarrel, their grief, their misguided attempts to reach one another across silence. Flaxborough, for all its gossip and invention, had responded to their pain with more imagination than malice, and Purbright, who understood the peculiar mercy of understatement, had simply steered the facts toward a kinder landing. That, he reflected, was the true work of policing in a place like this. Not the pursuit of criminal grandeur, but the slow, patient tending of human frailty. He left the window, gathered his hat, and stepped outside. The evening was peaceful, softened by the comfortable murmur of a town returning wholly to itself. Purbright walked home at an unhurried pace, content to let the quiet settle. The mystery had ended without spectacle. That was as it should be. Flaxborough, restored to its habitual calm, would soon forget the voice at midnight, except as a curious footnote in conversation, embellished, contradicted, misremembered, but ultimately harmless. And Purbright, as always, would be ready when the next small disturbance nudged the town from its usual slumber.